Part 9. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 87. Seeing that the guards here are heavily guarded, Rog asked, Dalton, how does the crane transportation equipment you mentioned operate? Everyone, wait a moment, you see that is the one. Dalton pointed to the side of the mountain. Roger and everyone else raised their heads. I saw a metal pod the size of a house hanging from above. 4 iron chains fastened the gondola tightly. It turned out to be like this. There must be a wheel-like device on the top of the mountain, which can lift the pod down, Rog said. The house-sized cuboid pod was finally lowered, and the pod slowly landed on the platform. Some soldiers took empty wine barrels and boxes out of the pods, which were all consumed supplies. Then the soldiers guarding near the platform brought the cargo of several carriages over. Among these goods are wine, meat, vegetables, and fruits, as well as coal and some cloth. Under the surveillance of many ground troops, the soldiers in charge of the pod transport opened the wine barrels and wooden boxes containing food for inspection. After these materials were transported to the vicinity of the ground platform, they were repeatedly checked many times. In addition to preventing people from drilling into them, they were also checked for toxicity. After careful inspection, the officer in charge of the pod officially transported these materials into the pod. The officer then used a phone bug to give the message to the person at the top of the mountain. The pod began to be pulled upwards by 4 thick iron chains. Rog, Dalton, Sanji, and others who were observing from a distance all saw this. The other party used this method to send supplies up. It seems that the personnel also used this method to ascend and descend, Rog said. It's very good. I suddenly have a way, that is, we hide among the goods and then go up, Usopp suddenly said with his eyes shining. Come on, look at how many times those goods were inspected just now, Sauron said. Is there no other way? Sanji said while smoking. Luffy kept moving, and said, it's fine to climb up. You can't figure it out when you climb up, Usopp immediately scolded. Rog looked at Luffy, and then at Iron Barrel Mountain. Climb up. Rog fell into thinking. The current situation is very serious. King Wapol's army is very powerful. They still have to find a way to capture the thief first and try to kill King Wapol first. Suddenly a good idea flashed in Rog's mind, which might be able to solve all this. Everyone, I seem to have an idea. That is, we can go to the top of this mountain together. So I can let everyone ascend to heaven on vines, Rog said. Ride a vine to heaven. Everyone else was shocked. I can use the power of plant fruits to grow thousands of meters of vines. However, it will take a lot of time and energy, so everyone needs to be well prepared and come here at the best time, Rog said. One more thing, because if the vines really reach such a high height, the enemy will definitely strengthen and hinder them halfway. Therefore, the enemy's attention needs to be restrained, Rog emphasized again. If it is true, then everyone must work together, Dalton said. Sounds really interesting, Sanji said. Then let's try, Sauron also said expectantly. Luffy and Usopp are also happy. Both of them cheered. It's great to ascend to the sky on a giant vine, Luffy said. That must be interesting. Usopp's eyes were full of longing. After thinking for a while, Rog continued, this mountain is very high, and everyone will probably become exhausted even if they go up by the huge vines. So, let's eat and drink first, and then climb. Okay, everyone said happily. Roger and Dalton left here first, and after returning to the huge basement created before, everyone made a detailed plan before officially starting the operation. When the time came to the next day, the heavy snow in the sky was still falling. Seago Kingdom is still heavily guarded, and the central mountain peak is even more heavily guarded. More than 1,000 elite troops of the King of Boars were recuperating in the built fortifications, which contained a large number of cannons and machine guns. There are also motorized cavalry on standby. Under such circumstances, Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy and Dalton led many men to the vicinity of the central mountain. This is it. According to the plan, my troops will feign to attack the area where the enemy troops are gathered at the foot of the mountain to distract them. There will also be feigned attacks by our personnel in other areas. The 5 of us will go up to the top of the mountain together. Dalton said. Okay. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy ride in a carriage, and the 4 get off the carriage and start walking. Dalton also dismounted and walked. You have to complete the task, Dalton said to his opponent. We swear to contain the enemy. They are guaranteed to be attracted in front of the mountain, Dalton's cotters said. Dalton, Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy watched the 200-man team charge. Okay, it's time for us to act, Roger said. Dalton looked solemnly as he watched his men charge bravely, then turned around and headed to the pre-selected position together. Everyone went to the rear of the central mountain, which is the east side. The 5 of them stood on the snow together, and Rog buried a vine seed in the soil under the snow. This seed is the size of a pigeon egg, and it is a vine seed modified by Rog. But it's not enough to just plant it. Rog's whole body has concentrated the ability of plant fruit. Green light began to radiate from Rog. Rog's hands shone with dazzling green light. 2 places to hold the hands down to bury the seeds. Immediately afterwards, the seeds below began to break through the ground and grow rapidly. The seeds quickly grow into vines as thick as buckets. Next to the main stem of the vine there are also a large number of foliage. Hurry up and get on board, Rog said. Dalton, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy all ride huge vines. Rog also rode on the vine. The huge vines grew taller rapidly, and Rog continued to use the plant's fruit ability to maintain rapid growth. What a spectacle, Luffy shouted happily. Not bad, Zoro also praised. It's very fast, Sanji said. It's really unbelievable, but since you caused it, it's not surprising, Dalton said. Everyone, keep up the hard work, we are accelerating. Rog had a calm face, and continued to work hard to release the energy of the plant fruit with both hands. The huge vines keep growing, and it becomes colder and colder as the height rises. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 88. Rog controlled the giant vines to continuously rise towards the top of the 5,000-meter high mountain. It's getting colder and colder, what do you think? Zoro said casually. The huge vines continued to rise, and everyone felt that the surroundings were getting colder and colder. It's really windy and snowy now, Rog said. Now everyone has reached a height of more than 1,000 meters under the growth of huge vines. However, the wind and snow became more and more intense. Rog, Sanji, Saran, Luffy, and Dalton are constantly rising on huge vines. At this time, around the bottom of the central mountain peak. Dalton's men engaged with the king's army. Disperse quickly, said a resistance officer on horseback. The 200 resistance forces dispersed quickly. The main role of Dalton's troops is to disrupt the enemy and avoid being disrupted at the important moment when they can use the giant vines to gain elevation. Under such circumstances, a large number of enemies began to be restrained by Dalton's men. However, this king's army can be used to guard the elite army of the central peak. Only a few hundred of them were attracted, and nearly 1,000 people were left to guard the bottom of the central peak. The top of this central mountain is home to the Wapilis, and if they fail in their duties they will lose their heads. In addition to the central peak, other places in the Sigu Kingdom. Dalton's resistance forces also successively carried out activities to attack the king's army. In the urban area near the coast of Drum Country. How is this going? How could there be an explosion? I heard that pirates and Dalton's resistance forces joined forces a while ago. Were they responsible for these attacks? People in the urban area took to the streets to watch in amazement. I saw that in the urban area, the smoke of the explosion was scattered for a while. Dalton's lurkers attacked the guard post in the city of the king's army. The king's army in the urban area belongs to the security force, and its combat effectiveness is far inferior to that of the mobile army under the command of Jess. However, they are still a large number after all, and they can still play a considerable role. The king's army quickly dispatched troops to hunt down Dalton's men in the city. Teams of King's Army cavalry and infantry brigades moved quickly in the city. The cavalry officers with tall horses rushed to various interfaces. Commander Jesse's order is to quickly intensify the search in the city. Ordinary houses and public places must also be searched. A large number of Dalton officers and soldiers broke into houses, as well as shops and bars, and searched wantonly. Many people hate it very much, but they only dare to bury it in their hearts. Wapoli and his army are as good as they get in Drumland. Has absolute killing power. A little dissatisfaction is a capital offense. Moreover, the economy also strictly controls the lives and economic resources of a large number of residents. Wapoli is like a god in the Drum Kingdom. However, the people have always hated Wapoli in their hearts. That's why Dalton and his resistance forces can be so active. Some people were wondering if today was a revolutionary war to overthrow Wapol. The activities carried out by the resistance forces on this day were also extremely intense. Wapoli's king's army was also fully mobilized. In this fierce battle, some ordinary people also seemed to want to join the resistance. But what can ultimately play a decisive role is whether Dalton can stir up enough waves. Jess was currently taking calls at a command post near the industrial area. The phone calls from various troops kept ringing. "Commander, we are under attack." "Commander, we were violently attacked by Dalton's resistance forces." "Commander, our supply warehouse is under attack." All kinds of emergency reports are endless. Jess was so angry that he smashed the table with his fist. "Dalton and the pirates are crazy." Jace yelled in anger. The surrounding officers are full of fear. Even if Commander Jess encountered something in the past, he had never been so angry. Jess was really pissed off this time. As the commander of the King's Army of the Drum Kingdom, he has been fighting with Dalton. In addition to Dalton, there are also pirates who have stepped in again. It has already made Jess fail again and again. But what Jess is most afraid of is Wapoli's safety. After letting his officers handle most of the reports, Jace personally inquired about the defenses around the central peak. "How come the central peak area was also attacked?" Jace said in shock. "Yes, Commander. The central mountain was attacked by Dalton's men. But we successfully resisted the attack of Dalton's men," the phone bug reported. Jess was still worried, and said, "You resist with all your strength." "I will lead the army to support." "Yes." Then the call ended. Jess thought for a while, and then ordered, "Let the hot air balloon troops go up to the top of the central mountain for reinforcements." Jace then used the phone bug to speak to the troops at the top of the central peak. "Hello, I'm Jess," Jess said to the phone bug. "Commander, what are your orders?" said the other side. "You should also know what happened below the central mountain. Therefore, I ask you to concentrate on preparing for the battle. His Majesty Wapoli's safety cannot be sloppy," Jess said. "Yes, Commander," said the other side. Jess then hung up the phone. Then, Jace stood up from his seat. "Get ready, I will lead the cavalry troops to support quickly. The cavalry troops and assault troops will quickly follow me to support. We will reach the central peak very quickly." After Jess gave the order, all the officers stood up straight. "It's the commander." Jess led the army and hurried to the central mountain. More than 1,000 elite cavalry and hundreds of carriages carrying a large number of special troops began to march. In addition, hot air balloons all over Drum Country are rising one after another. Walpole and Jess once imported a large number of hot air balloons from an arms dealer in Drexus to transport troops. The balloons were house-sized pods capable of transporting commandos as well as carrying 2 cannons and several machine guns. Just as Rog and others quickly used the huge vines to rise up. Usopp, Nami, and Wei also ran quickly to the east side of the central mountain. From here one can watch the ascension of the giant vines. It's so spectacular. Usopp looked at the huge growing vines in shock. The vines have now grown to about 3,000 meters. There are still 2,000 meters to the top of this central peak. The area around the vines was already surrounded by snow clouds, making it difficult to see clearly. I hope they are safe, Wei said. GA is also a blessing for running fast. Don't worry, Rog and Sanji will definitely be able to reach the top of the mountain, Nami said with confidence. Although Rog and the others only have 5 people, they can turn things around. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 89. At this moment, the army led by Jess also rushed here. Riding on a tall horse, Jess saw that Dalton's troops were in a fierce battle with the king's army guarding the central mountain. Hurry up for support, Jace ordered. Yes, several officers under Jess quickly led hundreds of cavalry to clear out Dalton's man army. But Jess felt something was wrong. There seems to be something wrong. The others are following me and continue investigating around the central peak, Jace ordered. Jess led the rest of the cavalry and a large carriage to scout around the central mountain. Jace and his troops arrived on the east side of the central peak. Here Jace stopped the horse in surprise. Jess saw a huge vine that could reach the sky and was constantly growing on the cliff of the mountain. What is this? Jess said in shock. The army he led also opened their mouths in shock. The central mountain in front of you is a 5,000-meter high mountain. Now the huge vine has grown to a position of about 4,000 meters. Jess reacted immediately and realized the dire situation. By the way, they definitely want Mr. Cheng's giant vine to reach the top of the mountain and assassinate His Majesty Wapol. Jess said in surprise. Jess quickly gave the order, the carriage troops will have all the built-in artillery ready to bombard the vines. Hundreds of carriages urgently prepared the cannons in the cabin, pulled them out, and quickly loaded them. Most of the artillery in these carriages are flat-fire cannons that can be aimed directly. The barrels of these flat-firing guns are very long as 2 meters. But the caliber is the thickness of the arm. There is a precision sight on the barrel. The words "Made in Drexus" are also engraved on the flat gun. These flat-fire guns are designed for precise aiming, can penetrate armor and hit targets with precision. More than 100 flat-fire cannons aimed their muzzles at the giant vines. Loading completed, fire. The artillery commander ordered. More than 100 flat-firing cannons fired powerful shells. A large number of cannonballs shot straight towards the giant vines. The giant vine hit the giant vine. This huge vine exploded suddenly. At this time, Rog and others, who had already reached the position of more than 4,000 meters, felt their bodies tremble for a while. What's going on? Sanji said. Not just a few people, but the entire vine was shaking violently. Rog turned his head to look at the ground, but saw a large number of King's army gathered on the ground. We were still discovered, Rog said. They're coming, Zoro said. Luffy kept shouting, look, there are a lot of fireworks on the ground. Dalton said with a serious face, the situation is serious now. The opponent has a lot of artillery units. After the artillery troops on the ground were loaded, more than 100 flat-fired cannons launched a new round of bombardment. The huge vines kept shaking, as if they were about to fall. Everyone, hold on, I'm using my last strength to quickly grow the vines to the top. Rog used all the fruit abilities in his body, and his hands shone with a more dazzling green light. The huge vines continued to grow at a high speed even as Rog used up almost all of his strength. The giant vine kept shaking, and Jace also discovered the bottom of the giant vine. Let the flat artillery units hit the bottom of the vine with full fire. More than 100 flat fire cannons violently bombarded the base of the giant vine. Under the fierce bombardment, the huge vines shook violently. "Give me bombardment and hurry up." Jace opened his wavy mouth and roared furiously. The huge vines were also damaged. Moreover, the higher the altitude, the more violent the wind and snow, coupled with the shaking caused by the shelling. The huge vine finally couldn't hold it anymore. The position of the ROG 5 is getting closer and closer to the top. Okay, it's still less than 100 meters away. Roger was exhausted. The huge vine finally rose to the top of the central mountain peak, and at this time, the huge vine also began to fall. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy, and Dalton jumped up. Jumped to the top of the mountain. The huge vines fell behind everyone. The 5 people stepped on the snow at the top of the mountain, surrounded by wind and snow. However, the top of the mountain is very flat. Sure enough, this mountain peak looks like an iron barrel, with an extra platform at the top. Rog's body was very exhausted, and he was the most exhausted among the 5. Just now, using the plant fruit ability to make huge vines grow to a height of more than 5,000 meters, it is enough to make people feel exhausted. Huh, I'm exhausted all over my body. Are you okay? Rog raised his head and saw a large group of heavily armed enemies in front of him. In the center of the top of the mountain is a magnificent palace built of gold. Even ice and snow cannot cover up its splendor. It's true that the enemy can't get in. There are so many people here who welcome us, Rog said. Sauron had already drawn the 3 knives out of their sheaths. You are tired too. Leave the rest to us, Sauron said. Roger also smiled and didn't say much. Dalton also took a sharp iron halberd from his back. This iron halberd was 3 meters long and could accompany Dalton in the charge. Luffy jumped up and down, and shouted excitedly, "Ha ha ha, we finally reached the top of the mountain." Sanji took out a phone bug and communicated with the opposite party. "Miss Waiwei, we have already reached the top of the mountain." "Don't worry," Sanji said happily. "That's good." Vivi's voice came over. "Ah, you have arrived. But don't worry, there are thousands of troops on the ground. Captain Usopp, I will help everyone deal with it." "You can go and deal with Wapol." Usopp's voice came again. Sanji said to the phone bug, "Okay, listen to our good news. I trust you." Suddenly, Nami's voice came over. "Miss Nami, for sure," Sanji said lovingly. "However, it's better to bring back some treasures of Wapoli." Nami's voice sounded again. "No problem," Sanji said with a flirtatious look on his face. Roger is very tired now, but he still took out a cactus. At this critical moment, Rog activated his plant fruit ability. The cactus grows into cactus power armor under the ability of the plant fruit. The cactus power armor covered Rog's body like a muscle mass. Although he was almost exhausted, he still had to fight the final battle. "The number of enemies is still not small," Sanji said. Hundreds of Wapoli's elite guards gathered ahead. The opponents were all wearing knight armor and holding cannons, machine guns, giant axes, spears and other weapons. "Come on, Wapol lackeys," Dalton said. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 90. About of Wapol's elite personal guards are concentrated here. Unlike the peak guards at the top of other peaks, the peak guards here are also Wapol's most elite guards. The SS soldiers wore armor and carried heavy weapons. With the cooperation of hot and cold weapons, they are ready to attack the 5 ROG. Destroy the invaders. A burly man with a height of 3 meters said. This burly man took the lead and rushed towards the crowd with a mace that could crush a horse. Dalton got close to him, then jerked away. The opponent's mace hit the ground hard. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Dalton swung his iron halberd and slashed at the head of this burly man. This burly man was also wearing armor, but the force of Dalton's blow was enough to shatter the solid rock of the footprints. There was a loud bang, and Dalton himself was shaken back. What a tough armor! Dalton looked at the burly man in shock. He, don't you know? Our armor is made of Wapoli alloy. His Majesty Wapoli made us all wear the hardest armor in order to let us soldiers fight hard, the burly man proudly said. Wapol alloy. Both Dalton and Rog were shocked. The opponent is wearing armor made of Wapoli alloy, so difficult to deal with. These guys look tough. Sanji jumped up. After aiming at an enemy holding an épée, it was a while of third level ground meat. This enemy is knocked back by a level grinder kick. However, the opponent was wearing armor made of Wapol alloy, so he did not receive any obvious damage. An enemy with a knight's spear rushed over and stabbed Sauron. Zoro jumped into the air, aimed at the opponent's neck and stabbed him 3 times. After a while of sparks, the armor around the opponent's neck could not penetrate. Sauron stood firm after falling to the ground, and turned to look at the enemy. It's not so hard, Sauron said with emotion. Lian Swezu, Hideo Yizawan, and Gish's 3 sharp blades could not penetrate the opponent's armor. And it's a relatively weak point at the neck. Wow, a bunch of guys in armor. Luffy jumped into the air and started punching. Rubber. Tempest. Luffy threw out hundreds of fists and hit several enemies. But the fists hit the Wapol alloy armor. Apart from causing some impact, the opponent still didn't take any damage. Rog was wearing the cactus power armor, and now he has recovered a little bit better. Seeing that these powerful guys are difficult to break through, Rog also intends to test the opponent's weakness. Look at the fist. Rog jumped up with his right fist and struck a burly enemy holding a meteor hammer with one blow. This blow made metal and iron resonate. The opponent was also sent flying more than 10 meters by a powerful force. It finally worked. Rog stood on the ground and breathed heavily. However, the enemy who was knocked into the air stood up again. The attack just now obviously did not kill the opponent. This won't work. Rog also frowned. The opponent is really powerful, mainly because he wears armor made of Wapol alloy and has extremely high defense. Whether it is hacking or hand-to-hand combat, it is ineffective to hurt the opponent. However, there are still ways to deal with these enemies. Don't be so worried, everyone, I have an idea. Roger said suddenly, full of confidence. Sanji, Dalton, Zoro, and Luffy all looked at Rog very strangely. Look at me. Rog dashed towards an enemy. This enemy is armed with a knight's spear. He suddenly wanted to stab Rog. But Rog's movements are more sensitive. Rog dodged the attack, lifted the enemy up and threw them down the mountain. What? With the screams echoing in his ears, the enemy fell from the top of the 5,000-meter high mountain. Falling from such a height, you don't need to think about what will happen. Rog turned his gaze back to the enemies at the top of the mountain. These enemies seemed to be motivated by fear or other reasons. They all retreated back. Look, throw the enemy down. Isn't it possible to avoid boring fights? Rog said. Since the enemy in front of him is difficult to deal with, his defense is extremely high. Then there's no need to bother, just throw the enemies off the mountain. What a great idea. It doesn't take so much effort this way. Sanji said happily. He flexed his ankles vigorously, wanting to hum hard. Since it is impossible to injure the opponent, then you can also kick them down. This method really saves effort, Sauron also said happily. He sheathed both knives. Only a handful of Hideo Yizawan was left and he clenched his hands tightly. There is no need to kill the opponent, just knock the opponent into the air with the strength of the blade. Luffy jumped up very happily and said, wow, just play the slingshot game. Bounce opponents away, this is Luffy's best fighting style. Dalton waved his iron halberd, and his body changed rapidly. Dalton's body changes from his original human form. The already burly body became stronger. The nose on the head became as huge as a bull's nose. 2 horns protrude from the top of the head. Dalton is the ability user of the animal devil fruit Neu fruit. The body can transform between human, animal, and animal forms. Now it has become a Tauren. The Tauren wielding an iron halberd can carry a tripod. Here, Rog, Sanji and the enemies are stunned. So handsome, Luffy said happily. It's getting stronger, Sanji said. What a cow, Sauron also said, squinting. Dalton, people are as loyal as cows. It really is in this form, Rog said. Now that they understood the opponent's weakness, the five of Rog looked at the enemy. Okay, let these guys roll down the mountain, Roger said. Okay, let's go together. The five rushed towards the Wapoli guards. Rog swung his fist and aimed at an enemy holding a long sword and shield. The enemy is knocked flying with great force and tumbles down the top of the mountain. Okay, that's it. Rog punched, or wrestled, throwing enemies down one by one. Sanji first kicked down a rushing enemy wielding a huge axe, and then kicked the enemy down the mountain with a side kick. At Sanji's feet, the enemies rolled down the top of the mountain one after another. An enemy with swords in both hands rushed in front of Sauron. Sauron dodged the attack. And started the attack from the side. One sword flow. Shake the mountain. Sauron's sword was so powerful that he sent the opponent flying to the bottom of the mountain and fell down. Even if the blade can't cut the opponent, you can also use human power to knock the enemy into the air. Luffy is the most evil, his body can be stretched freely. Sling enemies down mountains like a slingshot. Dalton was most valiant in this battle, and he and Wapoli were mortally opposed. What? This Tauren-like sweat swung an iron halberd to knock enemies into the air one by one. He really ran like a bull. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 91. Dalton wields the iron halberd with a boundless hatred of Wapoli and his army. The screams were endless, and the enemies on the top of the mountain were wiped out in large numbers under the valiant fighting. After a fierce battle, more than enemies were knocked down from the top of the mountain. Rog clapped his hands and said, "What a hearty battle." The fight wasn't good enough, Luffy said, stretching his arms. At this time, in Wapol's Golden Palace, Wapoli saw the battle firsthand from a window. What a bunch of lunatics. Wapoli couldn't help but gasped. The powerful personal guards under his command were easily defeated by the five Rog just now. With such fighting power, Wapol was also frightened. Wapol saw that the faces of the five Rog were extremely ugly. This tyrant had a very twisted personality to begin with, and now his expression has become even more frightening. Wapol's face became ugly, and the faces of the people around him became even more ugly. "Your Majesty, I think we should close the gate of the palace as soon as possible. Let's use the palace itself for defense at this time," the Prime Minister Cromaraman said hastily. Under such circumstances, only Cromaraman dared to speak like this. Wapoli glanced at Cromaraman and said, "Okay." Cromaraman hurriedly said, "Everyone is hiding in the palace and no more attacks are allowed. And the official defense of the palace has been activated." Cromaraman and other ministers rushed to carry out the order. Wapol also left the palace window and returned to his throne. Now Wapoli has become extremely manic and restless. He did not expect that anyone would be able to climb to the top of this 5,000-meter high mountain. And there is such fighting power. Before I heard Jess and the others say that the pirates they encountered were very powerful in combat. Now I see that it is true, Wapoli said. Speaking of this, he thought of Jess again. Wapoli quickly took out the phone bug that was designed to contact Jess, and started contacting Jess. "Jace," Wapol yelled at the phone bug. "Your Majesty, I have reached the bottom of the central mountain," Jess said. "Really? Hurry up and support the palace," Wapol said. "Yes," Jace said. Wapol then hung up on the bug. The current crisis situation has become extremely difficult. Wapol breathed a sigh of relief when he heard that Jace had reached the foot of the central peak. "As long as I keep this palace, I will be safe and sound." Reinforcements will arrive one after another, Walpole said. Kromaraman led the remaining hundreds of guards and ministers guarding the palace to quickly close all the doors and windows of the palace. Made of gold and steel, the palace is an impregnable fortress. Even digging tunnels can't do anything to this palace. The ground bases of the palace are made of gold and steel. Anrog and others outside the palace have now annihilated all the guards outside the palace, or in other words, they have all thrown them off the mountain. At this time, the palace doors were already closed. Oops, the other party closed all the palaces, Rog said. Just open the door. Luffy rushed to the gate of the palace. He violently attacked the palace gate with both fists, hitting him more than 100 times in a row. The final rubber siege bombardment hit the gate. But apart from the sound of metal trembling for a while, the door was not damaged at all. It hurts, Luffy screamed and ran around on the top of the mountain. Sauron also gave him a sideways glance, and then approached the gate. Sure enough, he tried 3 knives, but they didn't do much damage. It's solid enough, Sauron said. Sanji also observed for a long time, the palace has become like a fortress. All doors and windows have been closed. Really, there is no entrance, Roger said. But Rog then asked Dalton, does this palace have no entrance other than these doors and windows? Yes, no more. I used to work in the old palace before I rebelled against Walpole. At that time, the palace used by the old king had not been dismantled. Later, soon after Walpole came to the throne, he vigorously developed industries and gained wealth. Because he was in conflict with his tyranny, he left the palace. Then he built this golden palace, Dalton said. Looking at the golden palace, Dalton's eyes were full of disgust. What Walpole admires most is force and money. The Walpole army represented force, and the golden palace represented money. While everyone was thinking hard, suddenly a group of hot air balloons flew over. More than a dozen hot air balloons flew to the top of this central mountain. Hot air balloons are all 50 meters in diameter, with a 10-meter-long cabin-sized pod underneath. Don't even think about harming His Majesty Walpole. Voices came from the horns of these hot air balloons. The hot air balloons are equipped with a large number of elite King's army. The King's army came to support the top of the mountain in a hot air balloon. The 5 Rogers looked at the hot air balloons and felt a headache. I didn't expect Walpole's King's army to have an air force, Sanji said in surprise. Dalton frowned seriously and said, my men have talked about it. Walpole purchased a large number of hot air balloon weapons from Lexus. The balloon parts of these hot air balloons are specially treated, made of composite materials and leather, fiber, and wire. Enough to fight in cold areas thousands of meters high. The pod below is a 10-meter-long cabin-like pod. It was capable of carrying soldiers and loading machine guns and artillery. Inside a hot air balloon pod, a colonel, an officer and 20 soldiers prepare for battle. This colonel is also the commander of the balloon unit. Fortunately, we arrived. His Majesty Walpole's palace has been successfully sealed off. Now we just need to annihilate the enemy, the colonel said. An adjutant on the side said, then where is Commander Jess? Hurry up and tell him that we have reached the top. And His Majesty Walpole's golden palace has been closed, the colonel said. As ordered, the adjutant said. The colonel looks out the window of the hot air balloon pod towards the top of the mountain. These hot air balloons imported from Drexus are also known as air battle fortresses. The air combat fortress is the scientific name given to this weapon by the Drexus arms dealer. Air combat fortresses can operate at altitudes of several thousand meters. The power itself is a special fuel machine. On the one hand, the fuel machinery provides hot air for the hot air balloon above the pod, and on the other hand, it provides power to the propeller behind the pod. The air combat fortress can carry 20 soldiers, and it is equipped with 2 large-caliber artillery and multiple machine guns. This kind of air combat fortress is not very big, but it has powerful combat effectiveness. Put this rack. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 92. The aerial battle fortress surrounded all 5 Rog people from around the top of the 5,000-meter mountain. At this time, Wapol, who was in the Golden Palace, also learned from the palace guards that a large number of hot air balloon troops came to support them. Wapol, who was sitting on the throne in the palace hall, was now very happy. "It's really unparalleled joy," Wapol said happily, wearing a red robe and a crown. "Your Majesty, if this is the case, we only need to guard in this palace and wait forever." "Waiting for our army to destroy the enemy," Kromaraman said. In front of the throne, the Prime Minister and Kromalaman stood on the red carpet and looked at Wapol respectfully. "Yes, Your Majesty. We are saved. The hot air balloon force is enough to wipe out the enemy completely. After all, the enemy is a group of traitors and a group of foreign pirates. After all, they cannot resist your supreme authority. Long live His Majesty Wapol. You lead us to eliminate all villains and make the Drum Kingdom extremely powerful." The ministers also flattered together, full of flattery. The ministers who were full of worries just now became full of elation, and of course Wapoli is in a good mood. NOW.SO These ministers are going to go against the wind. Wapoli said proudly, "Okay, everyone. Now serve some delicious food and wine to impress everyone. We are here waiting for the good news from our army." After Wapol gave the order, the waiters in the palace quickly went to prepare. Soon the imperial chefs of the palace prepared the delicious food and wine, and asked the waiters to serve them. Although this is a hall for discussing state affairs, the waiters brought some tables and chairs, so that the ministers could temporarily have delicious food and wine with Wapoli. Plates of meat, fish and shrimp, vegetable salads, and fruit platters were put on the table. There are also various expensive wines. A 3-meter wide round table was placed in front of Wapol. The waiters bring the food. "Oh, roast turkey. I love it the most." Holding a knife and fork, Wapoli took the lead in inserting a roasted golden turkey in the center of the round table and stuffed it into his mouth. Many ministers and waiters looked at Wapol with forcibly calm expressions. Wapoli's food can be said to be perverted, beastly, and disgusting. But no one dared to say it. "What's the matter? Hurry up and eat," Wapoli said after swallowing the turkey. Kromaman quickly and respectfully smoothed things over at this time. "Your Majesty, you are a king. We all want to appreciate your awe-inspiring manner of eating. Even if you eat, you are in awe. You can see the long term in the small things. Wapoli, you really deserve to be the unparalleled great king in the world," Roman Laman said flatteringly. "Ah." Wapol looked at Kromaraman, his eyes full of weirdness. The other ministers put their hearts in their throats. "Ha ha 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 ha." Wapoli then erupted into laughter that filled the hall. "Okay, Kromaraman. You are worthy of being my loyal servant." "Well said," Wapol praised. "Thank you for the compliment, Your Majesty," Kromaman replied. Then Kromaraman also started to insert a piece of steak and ate it. But unlike Wapoli, this thoughtful minister kept asking the nearby ministers and guard officers about the situation outside the palace they observed. Wapoli ate and drank even more. "Roast suckling pig, I like it best." Wapol stuffed another tender roast suckling pig into his mouth. The waiter on the side just carefully took away the finished plates, and brought over the freshly prepared delicacies as soon as possible. Wapoli's emotions are complicated now, and he may even eat people. While feasting was taking place in the Golden Palace, a new battle broke out at the top of the mountain. Rog, Sanji, Sauron, Luffy, and Dalton were surrounded by more than a dozen air battle fortresses. These air combat fortresses are also masters, and they keep a distance from Rog and the others. Attention all air combat fortresses, keep a distance from each other here. Avoid close combat, the colonel in charge of commanding the hot air balloon unit said. Through the phone bug, all air combat fortresses have received orders. These aerial battle fortresses are all a while away from the top of the mountain, and the closest one is only 400 meters away. This distance is difficult even for Luffy to reach. Rubber. Remote grappling hook. Luffy stretched his arms for more than 100 meters, but still retracted them. Damn, these guys. Sauron also felt unable to deal with the enemy. The enemy learned his lesson and no longer managed to get close to attacking. Dalton looked at these aerial combat fortresses and said, hot air balloon troops, formidable enemies. What exactly are we going to do? Rog said as he looked at these aerial combat fortresses. Now the enemy also knows that even if it is an air battle fortress in close combat, it will take great risks. So, just keep your distance now. While Rog and the others were thinking hard, the colonel commanding the hot air balloon unit gave an order. All aerial combat fortresses, attack the enemy with load-carrying artillery. After giving the order, a total of 16 air combat fortresses aimed their 250 cm caliber artillery pieces at Rog's position. For a while, the artillery sounded, and a large number of shells were fired. Spherical shells were fired over. Luffy urgently used the rubber and balloon skills. But when the shell hit his body, a violent explosion occurred. Wow! The cannonball exploded directly when it encountered an object, blowing Luffy away. These shells are actually special shells that detonate when they encounter objects. How could this be? Sanji wanted to kick the cannonball back with his foot, but he quickly retracted his feet, allowing a shell to fly over his body. Sauron also didn't dare to cut the cannonball with the blade, but used the double knife trick. Eagle Wave. Sauron's two swords drew two sword chi, intercepting and detonating the two cannonballs. Seeing this, Rog quickly took out the Thorn Whip. The fruit ability in the body is activated. The green light was attached to the Thorn Whip, and the Thorn Whip grew rapidly. Thorn Whip. Skynet Hui. The Thorn Whip quickly formed a cube net more than 10 meters wide to block the crowd. More than a dozen shells hit the giant net composed of thorn whips, causing an explosion. After a burst of explosions, there were not many thorn whips left. These shells are really hard to deal with. It's all up to you, Roger, Sanji said. The others also took a breath, but it's not good to be like this all the time. Whenever Rog withstood a round of shelling, he needed to activate his fruit ability again to form a giant net of thorns and whips. And before Rog used the fruit ability in his body to consume to grow huge vines, which made his body very tired. Huge vines of 5,000 meters. Even Rog almost exhausted his stamina. This is not possible, we must find a way. Dalton looked around tightly. At last his eyes fell on the great fort on the top of the mountain. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 93. There are 6 huge forts on the top of the mountain, all of which are long-range huge mortars made by Drexus. Maybe we can use the weapons here, Dalton said. Sanji also looked towards the nearest fort. Dalton rushed over, and Sanji rushed over when he saw the situation. The two rushed to the top of the 3-story fort, where there was a long-range large mortar 10 meters long and 1 meter in diameter. What a huge cannon, how do I use it? Sanji said. Dalton observed the cannon urgently, and said, although this cannon is huge, we can still use it. As long as the cannon is so old, it will be the same. After Sanji also observed it, he groped around the cannon. The 10-meter-long long-range cannon also has mechanical wheels that can adjust height and direction. Dalton saw 2 wheels on the left side of the cannon. One is a horizontal wheel for orientation adjustment and the other is a vertical wheel for height adjustment. There is also a long-range ranging device next to the cannon, but it can only be used to attack enemies thousands of meters away. If you manage to attack the hot air balloon unit, just aim directly. Sanji also found 20 huge cannonballs with a diameter of 1 meter placed nearby. "Dalton, give it a try," Sanji said. "Okay," Dalton said. Dalton quickly began to adjust the cannon with the tilting wheel. The mechanical equipment of this cannon is very sophisticated. The horizontal and vertical wheels have linked levers and mechanical bearings. In addition, Dalton can easily control the cannon after transforming into a minotaur-like human animal form. The huge long-range mortar made by Drexus quickly turned to the muzzle and began to aim at an aerial combat fortress. Sanji opened the chamber cover at the bottom of the cannon, and kicked a huge black shell with a diameter of 1 meter into it with his foot. "Okay, fire," Sanji said. "Okay." Dalton pressed the handle switch on the cannon, accompanied by a huge roaring sound of the cannon firing. A huge 1 meter diameter artillery shell hit the targeted air combat fortress. There was an earth-shattering explosion. The hit air combat fortress quickly turned into a ball of fire. Flames and explosive debris scattered across the sky. This aerial combat fortress was hit by the pod below the hot air balloon. The pod was blown to pieces, and the hot air balloon above it was torn apart by the collateral damage of the explosion. After the air battle fortress was destroyed, the other air battle fortresses stopped attacking. The colonel in charge of commanding the hot air balloon unit saw the scene of his own being destroyed from the window of the air battle fortress he was riding in. The opponent actually used the cannon on the top of the mountain as a weapon. The colonel was extremely shocked. After successfully destroying the first air mobile fortress, Dalton and Sanji aimed at the next target. Sanji quickly finished loading again, and Dalton fired another cannon, destroying the second air mobile fortress. At this time, Rog, Sauron, and Luffy, who were at the top of the mountain, saw the power of Dalton and Sanji manipulating the cannon. "Wow, that's so cool!" Luffy shouted excitedly. "They really have a way," Sauron said. "Oh, they did a great job," Roger said. "Then let's join in too," Sauron said. Rog, Zoro, and Luffy ran to the top of another hilltop fort. Here, the three of them manipulated this long-range cannon to aim at an air mobile fortress to attack. "What a powerful force!" Rog also said after firing a cannonball himself. Rog and Dalton used 2 forts to shoot down 7 air mobile fortresses in succession. The enemy, who suffered great losses, quickly moved further away. The colonel in command of the balloon unit sits in his air mobile fortress and directs the battle. "Damn, these guys actually use those cannons in reverse." The colonel was full of rage. Now there are only 9 air mobile fortresses under his command. What's even more terrifying is that the long-range large mortars made by Lexus on the top of the mountain can have a range of several thousand meters. It can be said that these aerial mobile fortresses cannot be avoided. "Colonel, hurry up and give the order. We can't leave now. Those controlled cannons can completely wipe us out," an adjutant said. The colonel could be said to be so anxious now that he felt like he was going crazy. What's more, they were sent to rescue Walpole's palace from besiege. Even if he could escape, it would be a death penalty. "Anyway, it's death, so let's fight it out." The colonel finally made his decision. Immediately afterwards, the remaining phone bugs in the air mobile fortress all remembered the voice. All the remaining aerial mobile fortresses, close to the top of the mountain, attacked the 6 forts with full firepower. After the order was issued, all air mobile fortresses began to close the distance again. The 2 main guns in the pod under the air mobile fortress re-aimed at the turret where Rog was. "They're back again," Rog said. "When I felt that something was going wrong, suddenly a large group of shells were fired. These shells hit the top of the fort, and the huge long-range mortar vibrated. An enemy shell hit the tin box where the shells were stored. There are more than a dozen huge shells with a diameter of 1 meter in this box." "Oops," Zoro said in surprise. Rog had quick hands and eyes at this time, and quickly grabbed Sauron and Luffy and rushed aside. Rog is now wearing the cactus power armor, which is extremely powerful. In this case, Rog's body has great strength and defense. However, the impact caused by the explosion of the cannonballs also threw Rog away. Rog hit Wapol's golden palace heavily. "Damn, it really hurts," Rog said. Both Luffy and Zoro were also dizzy for a while. The fort where Dalton and Sanji were located was also hit by a group of shells. A violent explosion lifted the two of them into the air. Dalton and Sanji fall to the ground. The enemy's shelling was very heavy. Relying on the fierce shelling of the mobile fortress in the air, all 6 forts were destroyed one after another. In this way, the advantage on the battlefield returned to the hot air balloon troops. Standing up from the ground again, Rog saw that the forts around the top of the mountain had been destroyed. Those aerial mobile fortresses have once again widened their distance. "These guys are disgusting," Sanji said as he sprinted to your feet. Zoro was also covered in snow and stood up again with the blade in hand. Luffy looked a little strange. "What's going on? Why is it so cold here? My body has become inflexible," Luffy kept complaining. Because this is at the top of a 5,000-meter high mountain, Luffy's body is made of rubber, so it tends to become brittle. But fortunately, with its strong vitality, there are basically no obstacles. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 94. Everyone was suppressed and fell into passivity again. 9 air combat fortresses continued bombardment from a distance of about meters. Now the 6 forts on the top of the mountain have been destroyed, and Rog and the others are temporarily unable to fight effectively. The snow on the top of the mountain was blasted with huge craters one by one. Meanwhile, at the base of the central peak, after Jess led the elite troops to support, he drove away Dalton's harassing troops. Jess stood at the foot of the mountain, looking up at the 5,000-meter high mountain, and saw the wind and snow on the mountain, and the sound of explosions from time to time. "It seems very rare." Jess looked towards the pod platform. At the pod platform, the pod responsible for transporting materials and personnel to the top of the mountain fell on the platform, and the iron chain was broken. There was a fierce battle on the top of the mountain, and the chain was destroyed. The crane suspension machinery above must have been reimbursed as well. But what made Jess feel relieved was that the hot air balloon troop that arrived at the top of the mountain was already in charge of the situation. Wapoli's palace is also closed. Jace knew very well that the Golden Palace of Wapol was very strong. Not only artillery fire is difficult to destroy, and the materials inside are enough to last for a month. It can be said that as long as Wapol continues to stay in the palace and enjoy himself there, he can wait for the enemies outside to be eliminated. What is in front of Jess now is that more support troops need to be invested on the top of the mountain. Jess turned his head to look at the surrounding officers. "Everyone, what do we need to do to send the support army there?" Jace asked. Many officers looked at each other. What is before everyone's eyes is a problem: how to support the army to the top of the mountain. But now the hanging tower device on the top of the mountain has been destroyed. The difficulty of landing the army on the top of the mountain is comparable to climbing to the sky. "Commander Jess, I have an idea," an officer with a beard said. "Ah, tell me." Jess looked at him and said. "Do you still remember the sightseeing hot air balloon used by His Majesty Wapol? That is comparable to a penthouse. But if we use those penthouses, they can be used to drop a large number of soldiers," the officer said. After hearing this, Jess thought for a while, and his eyes lit up. "Okay, let's use those hot air balloon villas," Jess said. "Okay, let's contact the supplies department as soon as possible. Let them send over the hot air balloon villa used by His Majesty Wapoli," the officer said. "And, I ordered the entire army to enter a state of readiness. There are also hot air balloon troops fighting on the top of the mountain to continue to provide cover for our army," Jess said. Soon, after the order was given, the tourist villa that Wapoli had used flew over. 8 hot air balloon villas with a diameter of meters flew to the area at the foot of the central peak. These hot air balloon villas were ordered by Wapoli from a civilian company under the world government. A three-story villa is suspended below the hot air balloon with a diameter of meters. The villa is very beautifully made. In addition to basically maintaining the shape of the villa, the bottom of the villa also has a certain curvature like the bottom of a boat. Likewise, think of Navapol's particular favorite style. The outside of these villas were plated with gold. I didn't expect that these villas can now be used for combat purposes, Jess said, watching these huge hot air balloon villas. Okay, the military situation is urgent now. Everyone quickly familiarize yourself with the interior of the villa, and load as many weapons and soldiers as possible, Jess said. Yes, said many officers. A large number of officers and soldiers began to quickly enter these villas, and carried some weapons. Each villa was loaded with 90 soldiers, and 8 villas began to take off one after another. The 8 villas take off slowly, and these villas are of course able to withstand the cold and fly high. However, because the hot air balloon villa is for sightseeing, the speed is very slow. It's not the same as those military aerial mobile fortresses made by Drexus. At the top of the mountain, the 5 ROG tried their best to avoid the enemy's attack. The 9 air mobile fortresses make full use of the advantage of distance and exert powerful firepower. There was another burst of violent shelling, and the 5 ROG were forced to evade urgently. It doesn't work like this, Roger said. But ROG quickly set his sights on the Golden Palace. Although the Golden Palace has been closed. But you can still hide on it. Listen up, everyone, I have an idea, Roger said. Sanji, Dalton, and others all looked at ROG. Let's hide above the palace, ROG said. Then everyone rushed to the Golden Palace together. The 5 of them arrived at the upper part of the Golden Palace. Even the top of this Golden Palace has a large platform. Here the 5 of them were breathing heavily and finally able to take a rest. Dalton looked around in confusion. What's going on? The enemy seems to have stopped attacking, Sanji said. Could it be that? Sauron looked at the 9 aerial mobile fortresses. The enemy stopped attacking, Luffy said. ROG looked at the 9 mobile air fortresses. Sure enough, when he and Sanji arrived here, the other party did not attack again. Because this is Wapol's Golden Palace. Even those palaces cannot damage this palace, but Wapol lives inside. They didn't dare attack again. Sure enough, the enemy dare not attack again, ROG said. After all, this palace is the tyrant who lives in Wapol. If they dare to attack here, their heads will definitely move, Dalton said. Now it's all right, we can wait here. Find a way to break through this palace made of gold, Sanji said. Before everyone could continue to be happy, suddenly a group of hot air balloons that were bigger than the previous air battle fortress floated up. Below these huge hot air balloons are suspended 3-story villas. What? The villa, Sauron frowned and said. Because of their size, these huge hot air balloons rise much slower than the previous aerial combat fortress. These aerial battle forts flew above the top of the mountain, and then the villas below fell to the ground. The door of the villa opened, and a large number of heavily armed soldiers of the king's army rushed out. The king's army quickly set up machine guns and light artillery, ready to fight. There were a total of 8 hot air balloon villas, and more than soldiers of the royal army landed. Then the hot air balloon villa began to rise slowly again and left the top of the mountain. So many enemies have been reinforced at once, ROG said. Looks like we'll have to fight to the death, Dalton said. After more than soldiers of the royal army landed, an officer began to speak with a loudspeaker. Dalton and the pirates. You are already behind bars. Surrender now. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 95. The officers of the king's army used loudspeakers to persuade ROG and others to surrender. Rog, Sanji, Dalton, Sauron, and Luffy all looked at the king's army. These Wapol lackeys, Dalton said through gritted teeth. As the leader of the resistance forces, he is full of hatred for Wapol and the king's army. He still wants to recruit us, Sauron said. Rog looked at these enemies, and then said, these guys are still self-righteous. Give them a surprise. How? Sanji asked. I have a solution. You wait a moment, Rog said. Roger then took out a tomato. Tomatoes, what a fun thing, Sanji said strangely. Rog held the tomato in his hand and used the plant fruit ability in his body. The palm of the hand glowed green, and the tomatoes began to grow even larger. In the end, it was 5 meters wide in Rog's hands. Wow, I really want to eat, Luffy said. It's not for you, it's for them. Rog threw the tomato towards the king's army. The huge tomato hit the officer of the king's army, who was shouting, and a large group of soldiers were knocked down around him. Huge tomatoes were also smashed to pieces, and they were all dyed the color of tomatoes. How about it, enjoy the meal, Roger shouted loudly. Hey, you're wasting food, Sanji said, slightly dissatisfied. This is a weapon, not food. Please don't confuse them, Rog said. Sanji stopped talking and moved his feet, preparing for the battle. The king's army was already humiliated. The officer stood up and said angrily, attack with all our strength. More than king's troops began to rush towards the palace in groups. Here we are, you can move your hands and feet, Rog said. Fearing damage to Wapol's golden palace, they did not use artillery weapons, but only charged with firearms. A group of enemies at the front also had bayonets mounted. This group of enemies rushed to the platform at the top of the palace using the steps on both sides of the palace. The Rog 5 are here. Charge and kill Dalton and the pirates. There will be many rewards. The king's army rushed over with short-term bayonets. Rog waved his fist towards the enemy and rushed over. There was a scream, and the impact of Rog's fist and body knocked more than a dozen enemies into the air. The king's army stabbed Rog's armor with a bayonet, but there was no damage except scratches. This guy's armor is so powerful, the king's soldiers said in shock. Some of the king's army also fired, but no harm was done. Rog's cactus power armor is not afraid of cannons, let alone these bullets and bayonets. Under Rog's attack, dozens of enemies rushing up from the left were quickly pushed back. The remaining hundreds of enemies were unable to charge effectively and were firmly blocked. Dalton wields a halberd to help fend off Rogue's straying enemies. More than a dozen king's troops surrounded Dalton. Dalton, you traitor, is already hard to fly, an officer of the king's army said. Yes, you actually dare to attack the central peak. I'm really tired of living, another soldier said. Humph, let's stab him to death together, another soldier said. The officer of the king's army took the lead in slashing over with a sharp saber in his hand. Dalton swung his iron halberd and knocked him to the ground. The saber flew more than 10 meters. Some other soldiers rushed forward brandishing bayonets. Dalton glared at everyone with huge eyes like a cow. He squatted down halfway, swung the iron halberd with both hands and spun around, and bounced away more than a dozen enemy bayonets. Under the huge force, the rifles in the hands of these king's soldiers were knocked off. The king's army was scared back by Dalton. Dalton is now like a mighty Tauren, his imposing manner and strength make the people around him extremely fearful. This guy is so powerful, hurry up and use the pistol. These king's troops quickly took out their pistols and shot at Dalton for a while. Dalton was hit by dense bullets. But it was different from what the soldiers of the king's army expected. Dalton wasn't down, not even bleeding. After he turned into this Tauren appearance, the fur of his body easily resisted the damage of the gun. What a scary guy, he's not afraid of bullets, said the soldier of the king's army. This time, these soldiers of the king's army had no other choice. You lackeys, let me serve Wapol. With a cavity of anger, and strong strength, Dalton swung his iron halberd and knocked the king's soldiers away. But after all, there were too many charging enemies, and more than 20 soldiers of the king's army who had slipped through the net rushed up. These kings are also different, they are all burly and strong, exaggerated, the body can reach 3 meters tall. Holding a giant axe. This wave is a hand-to-hand combat force. And it's obviously aimed at me, Dalton said. More than 20 burly soldiers of the king's army armed with giant axes surrounded Dalton. Traitor Dalton, let's take your head off, the burly soldiers said. After Dalton's transformation, his appearance is similar to that of a Tauren, and his height is also close to 3 meters. The burly body of these guys looks exactly like Dalton's from the outside. Walpole is really rich. He used a lot of money to hire many foreign soldiers. You are too, Dalton said. These tall and burly soldiers glanced at each other, and one of them said, "Yes, we are soldiers of the famous mob mercenary group. It's unlucky for you to meet us today. On weekdays, you and the resistance forces are always fighting guerrillas, making it impossible for us to start," another said. "So guys, kill him," another one said. Dalton observed the 3 tall and burly soldiers who spoke, and they were almost identical in appearance. "Do you think we are 3 brothers?" Dalton said. "Yes, we are the 3 Rust brothers who led the former thug mercenary group, the Cash Drum Country's thug giant axe squad," the 3 said together. "Okay, then stop talking nonsense," Dalton said. Dalton swung his iron halberd and rushed towards one of them. One of the Rust brothers swung a huge axe and hit Dalton's iron halberd heavily. Although he blocked the attack, this guy also felt Dalton's amazing power. "You guys," one of the Rust brothers stepped back a few meters. "Your strength is not bad either." "I am a warrior who once knocked down a house," Dalton said. But after all, Dalton is still superior, and his strength and fighting ability are better than his opponent. The 3 Rust brothers and the surrounding giant axe team members were shocked. "Brother, don't be stubborn. Let's deal with him together." The 3 Rust brothers quickly surrounded Dalton from 3 directions. Dalton looked around. After the 3 brothers surrounded him, they actually became extremely powerful. Could it be that they are fighting together? There is no way to deal with it. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 96. After the 3 Rust brothers surrounded Dalton, they exuded a terrifying fighting spirit. "Dalton, go to hell!" the 3 Rust brothers roared together. At the same time, the 3 of them swung their giant axes and slashed at Dalton. Dalton suddenly felt the opponent's giant axe exuding an extremely powerful murderous aura. Even his strong body could feel the aftermath of the force generated by the opponent's giant axe. "What?" Dalton shouted and jumped up. This Tauren-like guy jumped to a height of 7 or 8 meters with great strength. The 3 giant axes of the 3 Rust brothers have already hacked to the position where he was just now. The 3 giant axes shattered the golden masonry on the ground. "You know, the gold in this palace has been specially processed. Even cannons are indestructible. Excellent destructive power." Dalton fell to the ground aside and said with lingering fear. The 3 Rust brothers waved their giant axes and looked at Dalton again. "Humph, you are a monster like a Tauren, and you are still very powerful," the eldest of the 3 brothers said. Dalton looked at the 3 brothers and said, "Are you also very strong? It seems that I also need to fight hard." The 3 brothers raised their giant axes again, and the 3 rushed over like lions. 3 giant axes slashed at Dalton with a force that tore apart the air. At this critical moment, Dalton ducked aside. Dalton quickly hid to the right side of the 3 brothers. The person on the far right quickly changed the direction of the giant axe in his hand and slashed at Dalton. Dalton quickly used the iron halberd in his hand to block the attack. There was an earth-shattering bang and sparks flew everywhere. The 2 weapons struck together. However, Dalton quickly found an opportunity, and after resisting the attack, he gave the enemy a horizontal blow to the waist. For a while, flesh and blood flew everywhere, and the opponent's waist was cut open. Second brother! Second brother! The rest of the boss and the third child roared in fright and anger for a while, resounding through the sky and the earth. Dalton stepped back a little further, and he had already successfully killed the opponent's second child. "Asshole, I want you to die without a burial place," the boss roared angrily. "Kill you," Lao San roared angrily. The eldest brother and the third child quickly rushed toward Dalton from the left front and left and right sides. Seeing these two enemies, Dalton also became mad. He swung his iron halberd and hit the third child who was rushing forward to the left. When Dalton approached the opponent, he jumped up suddenly and swung his iron halberd from the top of the opponent's head. With a puff, the third child still had a face full of shock and anger, and his head had already rolled down. The giant axe in his hand still had some power left, so he threw it away. Dalton fell heavily to the ground, and when he looked back, he was already decapitated. "Phew," the second one. Dalton poked the ground with his iron halberd and said. The only remaining eldest among the remaining three Rust brothers was furious. "Three brothers!" The other party's voice resounded throughout the world, but was quickly drowned out by the noisy voices on the battlefield. After losing his second and third brothers in succession, the eldest brother went completely crazy. He looked at Dalton with extremely hateful eyes. "I can't wait to chop Dalton into meat. Me all of you," Lao San said to his thugs, the Giant Axe Squad members. The Thug Axe Squad thought that the three Rust brothers could work together to eliminate Dalton. But Dalton killed the two of them back and was already too shocked to move. However, under the order of the boss, who is also the captain, he came to his senses and began to charge. Kill! More than 20 members of the Thug Axe team rushed over. After all, these burly fighters were also born as outlaws, and at this time they quickly charged again with their blood. Dalton carried the iron halberd on his back, and then his body changed again. The Tauren's original human beast form has become more beastly. Finally, Dalton landed on all fours and turned into a black yak 4 meters long. The black yak rushed towards the warriors of the Giant Axe team at an astonishing speed. The soldiers of the Giant Axe Squad saw this giant bull rushing towards it with astonishing speed. Dalton went on a rampage, knocking down his enemies one by one. The members of the Giant Axe Squad hadn't even gotten close to Dalton when they were knocked into the air. Dalton's huge bull's head combined with strength and speed, knocked away the members of the Giant Axe team one by one. More than 20 members of the Giant Axe team were crushed and eliminated in front of Dalton's powerful strength. The last boss of the Rust brothers was also surprised and angry. "Dalton is really a difficult guy to deal with. My second and third brothers, as well as my good subordinates who fought with me since the mercenary period. It's actually impossible to beat him," the last boss of the three Rust brothers said. After more than 20 members of the Giant Axe team were killed, the leader of the last team, who was also the eldest of the three Rust brothers, rushed towards Dalton. The opponent raised a huge axe, and Dalton slashed over. Dalton gathered all his strength and charged forward. The final blow had enough force to knock down a house, and it was paired with 2 huge horns. The giant axe in the hands of the boss of the Rust brothers was knocked flying, and 2 horns pierced through his chest. He flew out of the platform at the top of the palace. Dalton also stopped the impact. Although the battlefield was chaotic, Dalton's powerful combat power was already seen by others. Well done, Dalton. Rog was fighting, but he also saw Dalton's powerful strength. Can't help but admire. Sanji was teaching the enemy with his feet, but he also glanced at Dalton. The power really surpasses that of dinosaurs, Sanji said. It's really a good thing that we have such a strong partner, Sauron also said. Dalton, you're so handsome, Luffy said, waving his arms. Dalton, who received praise from everyone, was also full of emotions. He was still in the form of a yak and said, "Let us destroy these Wapol armies together." Okay, Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy shouted in unison. In addition to Rog and Dalton, Sanji and the others fought fiercely. Sanji kicked the king's army away with his feet. Aim at the enemy. An officer led more than 20 king's troops, who aimed their rifles at Sanji. Fire! Intensive bullets shot at Sanji. Sanji suddenly leaned back, almost lying down. Then the body stood up straight again. With a sudden jump, Sanji landed on top of the soldiers of the king's army. Level minced meat. Sanji's feet violently kicked the bodies of these king's soldiers. The king's army screamed for a while, and then fell to the ground and groaned. In the end, the king's army officer was also kicked down by Sanji. It's really boring, Sanji said. Is it really boring? Suddenly, an extremely cold voice sounded. Sanji looked to the right and saw a slender man standing aside.